Open research has a huge effect on everybody in sales, and I think arguably everyone in the business at the moment. And from my point of view, that's twofold. Firstly, the sales modelling piece, and it's vital that we take a leading role in coming up with sustainable models that take us from a present, arguably a past, in which we're selling content to a future in which we're providing publishing services. And I see the dialogue around open research at the moment as being really all about doing that. And at the moment what we're doing is creating new business models that help with that transition over a period of time. So from a sales director's perspective, it's very much about that. Speaking rather more broadly, there's a big policy piece here around how this affects publishing, how it affects IP, author rights, and it's a particularly interesting part of my job to be involved in that as a member of the academic board.
Open research affects all parts of our business in books and journals. It affects every team, journal, editorial teams, sales, marketing, legal, finance. So a large part of my role is to coordinate all of these activities and make sure we're aware of what's going on. I have a particular focus in our policies and our positions on various topics. And I also work quite closely not just with internal teams, but with our external partners and other organisations in this space.
In a sense, what we actually do day to day is much the same. A journal is still a journal. It has the same quality standards, the same editorial processes, and so on and so forth. But in a couple of ways, I think there are significant impacts on our daily work. So organisationally, we have to become an open access publisher. And that's not just at looking at our back office support, how we do production and so on and so forth, but really that everybody across the organisation needs to see the author as our primary customer, and that's a shift. And a second change is, as I've mentioned, our society partners are increasingly looking to us for support and advice. We've got the big picture about what's happening in open access, and they're hoping that we can help them think about their publishing strategies, the challenges ahead, the opportunities ahead.
The broader open research movement has actually meant that publishers have had to reorient how they do things across pretty much all functions. In Cambridge University Press's case, that led to the creation of my team a little over a year ago, bringing together open research policy and partnerships, open data, research integrity, research services, author services, and university collaboration. By bringing these areas together, our goal is to ensure that we're supporting our authors with their publishing experience and the research workflow tools that they need to collaborate and share their research openly, as well as addressing new policy requirements in step with changes from funders and institutions around open research.
The movement towards open research has been in motion for well over a decade, and early conversations which were purely around open access, and I think we've travelled a long way since then, had drivers about availability of content, about lowering the cost of access. And I think it's far more interesting and complex than that now, because with the advent of more sophisticated technology that we see every day in, for instance, social platforms, the fact that those have been rolled out in specific forms to academia means that there are real opportunities for researchers to collaborate across borders. If those platforms are open, then they're able to share results. They get their findings out more quickly to the world. There isn't a lag between finding and publication necessarily. And they're also able to capitalise on things like impact, usage, to really get their work out there. So those, I think, are positive drivers, pull factors towards an open research future. On the rather less positive side, perhaps, the pull factor of the pure economics of this, and the fact that publishing as a whole is seen as taking advantage of something which is publicly funded often enough, of making money out of that, perhaps too much money out of that. That's an issue which I think has escalated over the last couple of years particularly. And there's been a crisis in journals funding in universities brewing for decades. This was an inevitable outcome of that process, and it sharpened as the costs of access from some quarters and with some commercial organisations have become just unsustainable. My answer to that would partly be you need to look at the underlying system which is driving such a glut of publishing. But it is also the case that there are culpable publishing organisations which have been exploitative, and there is a need for change. So that's the sharpness, the intensity that we see around this right now. And I think that that's a very good thing. I think that there is real scope for making change that works and making it sustainable, and I hope that we'll be at the forefront of that change.
One of the most important drivers for the open research movement over the last few years has been the role of funders. So they've long had an interest in open access and open research, and they're very keen that the research they fund is read by as many people as possible and has the maximum impact that it possibly can. But I think this has led them to develop policies and other activities that has really driven the field, and has been a real kind of impetus for change and development that I think benefits everyone.
The drivers for open access have changed over the past 5 to 10 years. Originally, casting our minds back, I think apart from the moral benefits of open access, just because information was increasingly available online and was more accessible, there was a view that therefore we should do what we could do to make it as accessible as possible at the point of use, for benefits both to the consumer, the reader of the information, but also to the producer, the researcher, because that would only maximise the impact and the reach and the influence of their research. And along with that, again looking back 5 to 10 years, library budgets were becoming very constrained, and there was a hope, a broad hope, that somehow a different publishing model would cost the system less. Whether that's going to happen, I think, is moot, but it's fair to say that the decision maker about where to go, where to publish the research, is also the person responsible for payment, so there could possibly some market influences on the costs of the system. More recently, a lot of the momentum has come from the funders of the research, and they're not only becoming among the thought leaders in what's to happen next with open research, but they're also requiring and mandating open access publishing. This is because it's absolutely vital that they demonstrate the benefits of the research they're funding, that it actually has an influence, that there's, if you like, a return on investment from the money they put into the research. And making work available open access means that it's not only accessible, but it's reusable. It can actually make a difference, make a real impact on the world, on future research, if you like. So a lot of the momentum now that's really picking up is coming from a few funders, but very influential funders. They don't necessarily hold the purse strings to all the research being done, but what they say can not only, in a way, constrain where research can be published, though there is some resistance to that, but also I think influences the thinking about the importance of open access as well.
In terms of whether current approaches to open access are equally beneficial and accessible to everyone in the community and all stakeholders, no, I don't think they are. I think for readers it's probably fairly equitable. Certainly anyone with an internet connection can access content, open access content. But in terms of putting open access into the hands of the authors, I think that there's a lot more to be done. I'm thinking particularly of researchers in regions of the world where APC funds may be hard to come by, but also researchers working in poorly funded areas or unfunded areas, particularly humanities and social sciences, where gold open access is difficult for them. So while green open access may be available, that's not necessarily the best approach to open access, so I think that it's not equitable.
So the question is whether the benefits of how open access is implemented are common to all disciplines and all communities, or whether there are differences. I think the pure benefits of open access aren't in dispute and are common to all disciplines, all communities. Again, the openness, the reusability, the being part of a broader open research movement that values transparency, collaboration and sharing and so on. But how open access happens, how it's implemented, I think there are differences, certainly between disciplines. Much of the momentum towards open access and the mandates and requirements that have grown up have been very much premised upon how things work in the well-funded life and biomedical sciences. So just to take as an example, the fact that each paper is funded by a single payment, a fee, that works well where there are grant holders or wealthy research institutions. But in some areas of the humanities, it simply doesn't work like that. There isn't the funding. And I know there's been a certain amount of, let's say, concern in the humanities about the suggestion that Ref 2027 in the UK will require that monograph outputs should be made open access just like journal outputs. Much of the work that goes into a monograph isn't grant funded in the first place, so there isn't funding available to make those monographs available open access. There are also differences in how the Creative Commons license that's normally used for open access is viewed. For the life sciences, the pure CC BY license, which allows unrestricted reuse, makes sense, because if you like there, the creative input is the framing of the hypothesis and the design of the experiment, and the research output records the results and the data. In the humanities, quite often the creative act is the article itself, the author's narrative and thought process and conclusions. And so there's a desire there for there to be a more restrictive license. So the mandates, again, don't work in the humanities. So I think this is a reflection of the fact that much of the momentum has come from the life sciences. As the benefits of open access are recognised in the humanities and social sciences, and in fact in less well-funded areas of the sciences, I think we will see some changes there, and there will be a need for adaptations of business models.
It is going to be a challenging landscape as we try and make this work moving forward. I think one of the major issues with this, and it's an irony given that this is all about making research global, is partly the backdrop to that and the political backdrop to that. We're in a world at the moment which seems to be moving further apart from universal approaches to things and more towards a system of states or blocks that perhaps are competing politically much more than they ever did. How do you sit that alongside a world in which research is shared, where for so many years research output has been a product which has been traded between countries? There is competitive advantage in research output. So there's a whole area there that needs to be explored, because the funding models very often are fairly local in nature. So if you have considerable change in Europe and none, say, in the US, which is still one of the largest producers of research output in the world, what do you do? Because you've got two fundamentally different models in action at the same time, and resolving that, I think, is going to be one of the greatest challenges. At local level, as I said, once again, the economics of it, this has the power to free up a tremendous amount of budget in the university system. But then it's a question of what's that money going to be spent on? How's it going to be reused? How do we get from all of the spend going into subscriptions at the moment to that spend being used for publishing in open models in the future? And one of the big areas of challenge there, of course, is that in the sciences, there are funders and funding mechanisms readily available for much of this. It's a far more nuanced, vexed picture for the humanities and social sciences. And again, I would like to see a world in which we, as a responsible publisher, were connecting the different parts of the world that we service, where we were working with groups of institutions, perhaps across boundaries, on new models to help those areas sustainably move to open access. So there are huge areas of challenge. It's deeply political. It's going to have fundamental impact on university budgeting and funding, and obviously the way that the publishing industry does sustain itself. But there are massive opportunities at the same time.
There are many challenges to developing new and sustainable forms of open access. I think for many years the argument was just convincing people that it was a good idea. I think nowadays we're much more focused on the mechanics and the specifics of how we can make it happen in practice. And there are many challenges, and they're very wide-ranging. Many journals are supported by library subscription budgets, and those budgets aren't easily rewired to support open access. I think there are huge challenges around information flows so that we know and institutes and authors and funders know what research is being published and that it's open access and how it's been made open access. So there are many challenges, and I think that's what makes this a very interesting area for me personally at the press, and I think it's going to be an area of great development in the coming years.
Sustainable approaches to open access require far more consultation and collaboration than has been the norm in scholarly communication in years past. As a university press, we really see it as essential to engage with our communities of researchers, but we've also worked to engage other stakeholders, including funders, the Publishers Association, bodies such as ORCID and Crossref, and so on. It's really been an exciting time to engage with other publishers as well, to build a better infrastructure for open research. One recent example of that is Cambridge is a founding partner of the new Blockchain for Peer Review initiative. This initiative has the mission to make peer review more transparent and trustworthy by using blockchain technology to build a cross-publisher peer review ledger.
It's clear that the European approach to open access is far more radical at the moment, and particularly I'm talking about Plan S and the aftermath of that, but we've already had significant moves to gold in several parts of Europe. Other countries are heading for green, like Denmark. So even within Europe we have a mixed economy, we have a mixed picture, but there's no doubt about it that is far ahead of the rest of the world in concept, and that's going to pose a challenge which we'll have to work with the rest of the world markets to overcome. The real difference between HSS and STM on this is that in the STM subjects, by and large, and it's not true for all of the STM subjects, but it's certainly true of the harder sciences, you have funding mechanisms in place that already anticipate and in some cases are well down the path to open publication. It's a far more nuanced, less amorphous picture in the humanities and social sciences, but we can't even talk about HSS and STM as discrete blocks. Mathematics, for instance, being an example of a subject where there are significant problems with funding and economic models around this. So what we've got to do is look at genuinely different approaches for HSS and STM. And on the one hand, working with funding bodies to create subject pools for open publication in certain sciences is well underway. Archive, for instance, being an obvious example of something that could be built on. In the humanities and social sciences, there are significant open data projects underway at university level. It's bringing those together. I think it's working with groups of institutions across borders who share already an interest in contributing to research publishing through exceptional journals. It's the quality of the journal, the quality of the output that's still going to really matter here. Taking that into an open world where you have groups collaborating to fund these things is a far more interesting dynamic that I think could be transferred if we worked at the right level, if we worked with ministries of education, with the funding bodies, with, as I say, groups of like-minded institutions around the world to generate truly different models for doing this and effect that transition, then there are real possibilities, interesting possibilities for the humanities too, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.